for coming this evening. It is my honor, privilege and pleasure to be introducing Rabbi Dr Natan Slifkin to you all. Rabbi Dr Natan Slifkin and I go back many years, in fact to our first years in primary school together. Of course, at that point he wasn't Rabbi Dr Natan Slifkin, he was just Rabbi Natan Slifkin. But I think I have more memories than you do by the sounds of it. I do remember coming to your house once as a kid and you had a hamster and it came climbing up my jumper and you said, "Oh, that means it likes you," which I'm still not sure I believe it, but I choose to believe it. I think it's a very nice thing for you to say. But Natan always had a love and a fascination with the animal world, and from a very early age. I don't know, do you know when it started? Are you going to talk about that at all? Maybe? Okay, so he'll do his own intro basically. But it's great that he's here now. He lives in Bet Shem, it's just around the corner from my parents and sisters, which is great, so I can send some stuff back with him. But it's also great that he's able to join us on this whistle-stop tour of the UK, of London, and we really appreciate having you here. So without any further ado, I'll hand the floor to Rabbi Dr Natan Slifkin.
Thank you very, very much. Really great to catch up with an old schoolmate and to be in this absolutely magnificent shul. So yeah, I was the kid who was crazy about animals, and people say, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" And I said, "I want to have a zoo," which of course everyone laughed at because that is not obviously a realistic career prospect for an English Jewish boy. Although, funnily enough, there was a certain English Jewish boy who always wanted to have a zoo and ended up having one. Who was that?
Somebody Rothschild.
More than Walter Rothschild, indeed, yes, the nephew of the Rothschild up here. Right. But so it's certainly not a conventional path. So they said actually you can do something more realistic in a computer program. Right, fine, computer program. Then after finished school, I went to Israel, went to yeshiva, decided I wanted to become a rabbi. Definitely not a job for a nice Jewish boy. But then one day, about 30 years ago, I thought, what does the Torah have to say about animals? And I found this incredible, unmined treasure trove of information, and I started writing books about it, giving lectures about it. And eventually, 11 years ago, I opened up a museum, the Biblical Museum of Natural History, focused on the connection between animals and the Bible. Anyone here been to the museum?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. All right, now, so, at the museum, teaching all interesting things about identifying animals in the Torah, looking at their symbolism, and the laws relating to them, which animals are kosher or not, and all of shofars, and so on and so forth. And then, October 7th happened. Right, so everyone, was shocked. What can we do to help? So, there were a lot of evacuees from the north and the south who came to the center of the country, which is where we are. So we arranged to give, free admission to evacuees. And when they were coming to the museum, we have a lot of live animals in the museum too. And they were saying that the children found it very therapeutic, right, to be able to pet all the different animals. So we leaned into that angle, started doing animal-assisted therapy to help with a lot of the trauma in Israel, subsidized programs for families of reservists and so on. But aside from these kinds of things, it suddenly occurred to me that there was also an intellectual role, a message that we had to share that was very relevant to what was going on. So how do animals connect to politics? I never thought when I opened a museum would have anything to do with politics, right? We get visitors from across the full spectrum of Jewish society, Christians, some Arab visitors. The museum is very much a non-political institution. So what is the relevance of animals to politics? So we'll get. That's what I want to get to tonight. Let's start off with something. Let me start off with a question. If you look at shul art, occasionally it features animals. Not so much in this shul, except the Sifrei Torah. So all the Sifrei Torah, the covers of them have lines on them, and the metal plates also have lines. Look at a lot of shuls in Europe. They'll have lines painted around the shul also, or in the art. They'll also have some other animals. They'll have deer, and occasionally you'll even see a tiger. Now, when it comes to Tanakh, to the Bible, So we know that there's a lot of mentions of lions, that's for sure. In fact, lions are mentioned in Tanakh 150 times, right? More than every other animal put together. What about tigers? Where are tigers mentioned in Tanakh?
Joe?
Nope.
No.
Queen of Sheba.
Nope. Answer is
Yeah.
nowhere. Big question.
Nowhere.
Tigers are not in Tanakh. Right, so, and yet they do appear in certain shuls, in certain shul artwork. So why is that? So let me ask you another question. Where are pandas mentioned in Tanakh?
Pandas aren't, but bears are.
Right, pandas are not, but bears are. Correct. How about kangaroos? Where are kangaroos mentioned in Tanakh? No.
Oh, they're in Noah's Ark.
So what do kangaroos and pandas and tigers have in common?
That's true.
Oh, they're in a different area.
Exactly. Right? They don't live in the part of the world where Tanakh takes place. Now that's the kind of thing that may sound completely obvious, but it's only obvious once you know it. Right? In other words, until a couple of hundred years ago, people pretty much assumed that you have the same animals all over the world. Right? They knew that there's the occasional really weird exotic thing that comes from some faraway place, but by and large everyone assumed that whatever animals they see around them, or the same animals, that everyone sees around them. Right? It was only after America was discovered, where the animals were really very different, that people started to study everything more carefully and realize that different parts of the world have different animals. But the ramifications of that for understanding Tanakh, the Bible, was still not adequately taken into account. And even until today. There's people who are looking at Tanakh and they're trying to figure out, what animals is it talking about. So they'll look at, some footnotes and it will quote some, some authority, whatever, but not without taking into account, well, where did this person who's identifying it, where did he live, and what animals was he familiar with? Okay, so this may sound, once you know it, okay, fine. So now we know it's clear Tanakh takes place in a particular part of the world, and therefore the animals of Tanakh will be the animals from the part of the world where Tanakh takes place, right? The land of Israel, the surrounding area. But obviously not the animals that are in Israel today. Right? It means the animals that were there in biblical times, which includes a whole lot of animals that were not there today. And most prominent, of course, is the lion, like I mentioned. Right? Lions live wild in Israel. Right? And there's lots of other animals too that used to live in the land of Israel in biblical times. Leopards, right? Bears, cheetahs, crocodiles. In the early 20th century, there were wild crocodiles living in Israel. Hippopotami, it's going a bit further back, 3,000 years ago. Right, wild hippopotami living in Israel. Right, a lot of these animals you often associate with Africa. These are things that used to live in the land of Israel. Now, when it comes to, and obviously many of them are mentioned in Tanakh in different contexts and so on, but there's 4 animals in particular that are mentioned not just in Tanakh, but also in the Mishnah. Right? And there's a Mishnah about these animals that was illustrated more than any other text in Judaism, especially in synagogue art, on walls of synagogues, on a Kodesh, on Sifrei Torah, and flags, and all kinds of different things. And it's a Mishnah which says as follows. Rabbi Yehuda ben Tamer says, this Mishnah lists 4 animals and says we should emulate their characteristics to serve God. So one of them is, it says you should be like a lion. What's the essential character trait of the lion in Judaism? Anyone know?
Strength.
Strength. Right. Not courage, that's the Wizard of Oz. Right? In Judaism it's strength. Right? So the Mishnah says, Gibor Kari, right? Be as strong as a lion to serve God. Right? And it says also you should be Ratz Katzvi, as fast as a tzvi. Anyone know what a tzvi is?
Deer.
A deer. Right? So that's why I got all these pictures of deer. Right? And it says you should be Kal Kanesher, as light as a nesher, the king of birds. What's a nesher? Eagle.
So he says vulture.
Hold on. Right. So at this point I should mention that this is actually not correct. The nesher is not an eagle, and the tzvi is not a deer. Now, how do I know that the tzvi is not a deer? You have a name there, Tzvi Hirsch, Hirsch being German for deer, it's a very common name, Tzvi Hirsch. So how do I know that tzvi is actually not a Hirsch? Well, that's because the Talmud says very explicitly that the horns of a tzvi are not branched. But the horns of a deer are branched, right? Antlers. So the Talmud says that's not what the horns of a tzvi are. So Rashi there says, so it must be. Rashi there is very confused. He says, you look at a hirsch, you look at a deer, it's got branched horns. So Rashi says it must be that what we call a tzvi, i.e. the deer, is not really the tzvi of the Torah. So what is the tzvi of the Torah? Anyone know? Gazelle. Perfect. Right? Gazelle. A gazelle. Right? Which does not have branched horns. Very beautiful animal, very fast animal. Right? Back. And then we have, it says, as light as a nesher, the king of birds, which you all identified as eagle, which is certainly the conventional translation. Right? And in all the synagogue art, it shows eagles. But it's not an eagle. How do I know? Because again, there are verses in Tanakh which describe the nesher as being bald. Are eagles bald?
In America, yes.
We have an American here, no?
Yeah.
Are bald eagles bald?
No.
No. A fine head of hair. They just have white feathers on their head. They were originally called baldy-headed eagles, B-A-L-D-E. It's an old English word meaning white. They were white-headed eagles. Right? But they're not bald. Plus, the nesher is described as feeding on carrion, right? Dead animals. Eagles usually take live prey. So which bird is bald and feeds on carrion?
Vulture.
Vulture, right? Specifically the griffin vulture. Right? It's our king of birds, magnificent bird, right? Huge wingspan. And the Mishnah says, be as light as a vulture, soar effortlessly. Right? Vultures soar up on the thermals to unbelievable altitudes. In fact, if you look at the Guinness Book of Records, the altitude record for a bird is held by a griffin vulture, which hits an airplane at 37,000 feet.
Wow.
Right? So, I mean, it's very interesting, because normally, you say you'd be as light as a nesher. It seems weird. You think it's talking about, well, it's one of the heaviest of birds, right? I've held griffin vultures, right? They're really heavy, but it doesn't have to do with how it weighs, it has to do with how it flies. It soars up effortlessly. Okay. And then the final animal mentioned in the Mishnah is as kanamer, be as brazen as a namer. What is a namer? Leopard. So leopard is correct. That is the correct identification. But a lot of people misidentified it as a tiger. And that's how I mentioned that in certain synagogues you'll see tigers painted on the walls, because it's where this Mishnah appears, and doing as a tiger. Right? So, so like I said, this Mishnah has been illustrated more than anything else in Jewish history. And yet, when you look at it, by the way, only in Ashkenazi lands. In Sephardic lands, they never had any kind of animal imagery in synagogues. Anyone know why?
Why?
Because of Muslims.
Because they lived in Muslim countries?
Yes.
Which it's not allowed.
Right. So the Muslims are very particular about never having animal imagery in any holy place. There's a list of idolatry, so the Jews also didn't want to be any more lenient than the Muslims. But in Ashkenaz countries, so it was very common to illustrate this Mishnah. So, lion, everyone knows what a lion looks like, but in every single case they're showing the nesher as an eagle instead of a griffin vulture. They're showing the tzvi as a deer instead of a gazelle, and they're showing the namer as a tiger instead of a leopard. So why is that? Why was this mistake? Why were these mistakes continually made?
Ignorance?
A little bit more than that, though. But why?
They just didn't know the difference, did they? They didn't see these animals in Europe.
Exactly.
They were zoological gardens.
Right, exactly. In other words, it comes back to what we're saying, that the animals of Tanakh are the animals of the land of Israel, not the animals of Europe. In Israel, you have gazelles and deer. You've got both animals. And I've seen them both in the wild in Israel. A gazelle is a tzvi in Hebrew. A deer, you know what a deer is called in Hebrew? A yow. And you've got both animals. In Europe, on the other hand, which is in England, right, lots and lots of deer here. Ever see a gazelle? No gazelles. Right, so Jews in Europe transferred the name tzvi from the gazelle to the deer, because that's what they have. Right? Nesher is a griffin vulture. Now used to be lots of griffin vultures in Israel, obviously not so many left anymore. But how many griffin vultures are there in Ashkenaz, in France and Germany? Right, none. So what was the king of birds in France and Germany? The eagle. Right, so we got transposed. Now, leopards, which lived in Israel until very recently, until when I moved to Israel from Manchester 30 years ago, there were still wild leopards living in Israel. Right? Now, not too many leopards in Europe, and in fact, no big cats in Europe. So they knew that namer was some kind of big cat, and they knew it wasn't a lion, right? So the only other big cat they knew was the tiger. The tiger was the most famous was the only known big cat that was not alive. So that's why the Namer is always being painted as a tiger instead of a leopard. Okay, so this is how these kinds of mistranslations arise, and it happens again and again. For example, anyone know the Israeli nursery rhyme? Hashafan, hakatan, shaflisko, hadelet. It's done then, right? Shafan, right? Popular animal in Israel. What's it mentioned many times in Tanakh? What's a shafan in English?
Rabbit.
A rabbit, a bunny rabbit, yes. Except again, no. Because one of the verses describing the shafan in Tehillim, Barki Nafshi, Psalms 104 that we say in Rosh Chodesh, speaks about Harim Hagavohim La Ya'elim, the high hills are for the Ya'elim. Ya'elim are mountain goats called ibex. That continues Sala'im Machset L'Shpanim. Oopsie. Sorry. Okay. And continues Sala'im Machset L'Shpanim. The rocks are a hiding place for the Shpanim. Now, do rabbits hide in rocks? No. Where do they hide? In burrows. Right, not in rocks. Plus, there's no rabbits in the Middle East. Right? Actually, no, it's funny. Watership Down, right? Yeah. Fantastic, deeply traumatic story. Right? And about such a British animal, the rabbits, right? Such a British animal. Rabbits are actually from Spain. They were imported to the British Isles a couple of centuries ago. Certainly no rabbits in the Middle East. So what is this shafan? So what do we know about it? We know it hides in rocks. But the other thing we know is that it's associated with the Ya'el, the mountain goat, the ibex that appears in the same verse. And that is the giveaway. Because we know exactly what King David is talking about. He's talking about an area in Israel that's very famous for these mountain goats. You can go there today, 3,000 years later, and see them. Anyone know which place that is? In Israel? Ein Gedi. Ein Gedi. And what else do you see in Ein Gedi? You see little furry animals hiding in the rocks.
Rock hyraxes.
Rock hyraxes. Very good. Hyrax. Hyrax. A hyrax. Funny little animal. We've got a colony of live hyraxes at the museum. They look kind of like big guinea pigs, but they're actually most closely related to...
A badger.
Nope.
Oh, like a hide.
A marmot.
Elephants.
No.
Yes.
No.
Elephants.
No.
Anatomically, they are completely not rodent-like in any way. Anyway, so the shafan is the hyrax. So, if the shafan is the hyrax, so why do all these translations say rabbit?
Because
That's what we knew, right? Exactly. In fact, the story goes, all the rabbits, like the rabbit we have in England too, originally they were all in Spain. Right? Spain, thousands of years ago, the Phoenicians sailing west from Eretz Israel got to the Spanish peninsula, and they discovered this land and saw these little furry animals hopping around that looked quite similar to the hyraxes, to the shafanim they knew from the land of Israel. So they decided, aha, we shall call this land Shafania. Espana, Spain. I have no idea if that's true, but that's the story they say. Okay. So, again and again you see this idea that these animals, the biblical national history, is the history of the Jewish people, right? It's after the exile, the dispersal, Jews spread out all over the world, so they started substituting different animals for the original animals, depending on what they were familiar with, wherever they ended up. So that's how we used to present that topic in the museum before October 7th. But after October 7th, I realized that there's another way of looking at all this. So we know, aside from, there's the military war, right, and with all its horrors and difficulties, like my son right now is stationed in Lebanon, protecting our northern border. And, but there was also the ideological war, right, that Israel has no legitimacy. And that's something which very much came from academia, in the US, in the UK, elsewhere. And what it came, and in terms of the academic attack on Israel's legitimacy, it's presented under the paradigm of settler colonialism. Right? Settler colonialism is the dominant paradigm in contemporary political thought. Everything is viewed through that lens. And what does settler colonialism mean? It means that certain, countries, like especially the US, Canada, Australia, right, are illegitimate because they are settler colonial countries. What I mean means the Europeans sent out settlers, right, to extract resources for the empire and to oppress, they took advantage of, exploited, oppressed the people in those countries, all in order to exploit them, right, send the riches back home, and therefore these countries do not have legitimacy. And really the legitimate owners of these lands are the indigenous people. And the indigenous people, they're the ones who were not just indigenous, they're connected to the land. Right? These are the people who had a harmonious relationship with the land before the Europeans came just to exploit. And that's a narrative like you'll see in Dances with Wolves in that film, or in the science fiction context in the film Avatar. Right? And that's the dominant paradigm. That's why in Australia, right, so for example, they're very big into land acknowledgements, right, everywhere. You have to acknowledge who this land, which tribe of Aboriginals, indigenous Australians, right, this land originally belonged to before the British came and stole it from them. Right, which some Australian Aboriginals say, whoop-de-doo, forget the acknowledgements, we just want our land back. Right, but this is the kind of thing that goes on. Now, truth is, settler colonialism as a framework itself is inherently problematic. Why? Because this idea that, let's take America for an example, right? That the British or the Spanish or whatever, they were not the legitimate, right? They had no legitimate right to it. It was the Native Americans. Now, and some people based on that will not call America America. They'll call it Turtle Island, right? Which was the indigenous name for it. But when you look into it more, it's a bit problematic. It's not as though Turtle Island was the indigenous name for America. It was the name used by one indigenous tribe. It's not like the Native Americans were one people. Right? There were lots of different tribes who very often were killing each other. Right? They were at war with each other, and they kept stealing land from each other. There was a whole bunch of different nations that kept stealing land from each other. And some of them welcomed it when the whites came, because then they had more power, they could join forces with them to oppress some of their other neighbors. So the whole world is like this. Everybody always took land from someone else. That is just how it works in history. No one's the original owner of the land. Everyone at some point took it from somebody else. Now, you can talk about how with the Europeans there was more maybe exploitation, but at the same time, with all the horrors and the cruelties, there were also benefits they brought. Medicine and things like that. You can fill a whole book with all the wrongdoings of settler colonialism. You can also fill a whole book with all the benefits. It's just much more complicated than the narrative is presented. Or you have this idea of Dances with Wolves. Love that film, right? So you've got about the Sioux Indians, right? And they're hunting buffalo from the horses, right? And then the whites come and just kill all the buffalo, right? Hunting buffalo. How old a tradition was that for the Native Americans? Buffalo are fast, right? So how do you hunt them? On a horse. So where are horses from? Europe. There weren't any horses in America. The whole thing of Indians hunting buffalo only started when they got horses from the Europeans. And they also killed as many buffalo as they possibly could. Right? So these narratives of settler colonialism start to break down when you start to look at them. But anyway, putting that aside, the paradigms that's applied to Israel is applied to Israel most strongly. Because with America, with Canada, with Australia, no one ever thinks you're going to be able to undo them. But with Israel, people see it as a chance to actually undo it. Right? You can undo Israel, right? Return it to its original indigenous people, the Palestinians. Right? And therefore people can campaign for Israel to be destroyed, dismantled, whatever it is, and they can feel very, very virtuous about it. Right? Because the Jews, the Zionists, are the settler colonials, right? Whereas the Palestinians are the indigenous people. So you can be the hero who dances with the wolves. Right? It's actually funny. A couple of years ago, I did a program at Tring, right? Rothschild's museum at Tring, for the Ali Sion Jewish community. And so beforehand, I went in, I was speaking with the manager at Tring, and we were talking about Rothschild. And a very interesting person, Lord Walter Rothschild. He was very much on the spectrum, the autistic spectrum. And the manager said, and was speaking about him, and said, yeah, and he was also, of course, a Zionist, but I suppose in those days that was considered to be acceptable. But the crazy thing is that he was talking. He knew I was a rabbi from Israel, and yet he took it for granted that I would also think that Zionism is something objectionable. That's why it was bizarre. Anyway, now the problem with applying the settler colonial paradigm to Israel, well, there's a few problems that it breaks down. Firstly, it's not as though the Jews who came to Israel were extracting its resources and sending them back to the empire at home. Right? There wasn't any of that. And they weren't coming to exploit, to take advantage. What were they coming to Palestine for?
Redeem the land.
No.
Get away.
There were some idealists who were coming to redeem the land, yes. 95% of people there were not coming for that reason. To survive! They were coming, they needed a place to live. Right? Rothschild. Rothschild, he only really cared about animals, right? He didn't care about banking. He was never really involved in Zionism that much either, except then he suddenly got very into it. Why? Rothschild realized that the Jews in Europe were doomed. He didn't realize how bad it would be, but he knew it was going to be bad. And he was very into preserving endangered species. And he had 144 giant tortoises from Aldabra that he imported, right, in order to preserve them from extinction. The zebras, the coach with the zebras, yeah. And it was a matter of survival. It's not like when the British went to America, to Australia. This was people fleeing for their lives. So that's the first, and most significant, crucial way in which this whole settler colonial paradigm breaks down with regard to Israel. It was about survival. Yes, there were some idealists redeeming the land, but for most people it was just they needed a place to live. And they looked into other options. There weren't any other options. They looked into Kenya, they looked into Tasmania, they looked into Suriname, and nothing else was viable. But there's another part to it too, which is they didn't just pick a random place. Right? And these other places didn't work. One of the reasons why these other places wouldn't work is that they realized it would be incredibly hard to resettle a lot of people. It would take tremendous effort. And that kind of effort was only going to be attainable with a land that people felt a connection to. And the only land people would feel a connection to would be the land of Israel. Right? So people will say, conventionally when you talk about that, something I want to stress, in this whole discussion about indigenous versus colonial or anything like this, none of this has anything to do with political rights. Right? Political rights is a completely separate topic. Right? We believe, even if you believe that somebody in America, a white European living in America, right, people think he shouldn't have political rights. Right, so none of this has anything to do with political rights. I mean, he's talking about the narrative that's, especially in academia, spreading about indigenous people versus settler colonials. That narrative completely breaks down here because it's the Jewish homeland. Now, when you talk to people like this, you can talk about how, yes, there was an ancient Jewish commonwealth in the land of Israel, we had the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, and so on. And there are some people who deny it, well, actually just deny the archaeology, but generally most people accept as a historical fact there was an ancient Jewish kingdom in the land of Israel. But what they say is, well, that was thousands of years ago. Right? That was thousands of 2,000 years ago. What connection do 19th century and 20th century Jews from Europe have to do with the ancient Israelites? It's a completely different culture. And this is where biblical natural history plays a role. Let me explain. After October 7th, we put up this gigantic map of the world in the museum. And on this map, we're mounting different artifacts which illustrate how animals play a role in human culture. Now, animals play a role in human culture in all kinds of ways. They may have certain symbolic significance. There may be certain special stories people tell about them, or songs people sing about them, or art people do about them, or even name people after them. And we do that too. These Ashkenazim do against spouting dough. Anyone here got an animal name? No? No Harriers or the Isles or anything here? No?
What's the question? Sorry, I couldn't.
If anyone here has an animal name, if anyone here the Hebrew name is an animal name.
My father's was Dov.
Dov, there we go, we've got a bear.
Well, my father was an Allier.
Svi Hirsch.
Svi Hirsch.
My father was an Allier, and his father was a Ze'ev.
There we go. Right. So, and you see it in other nations also. Okay. So on this map, I'm giving an idea of some of the artifacts we've mounted on this map. So, for example, Australia, I put a boomerang that I bought in Australia, and this particular boomerang has an animal painted on it, namely the animal that used to hunt with the boomerang. What animal is that?
Man.
No. Australia. What animal are they painting the boomerang? Kangaroos. Thank you very much. Yes, kangaroos. Right, and we've got African art, which features, lions and giraffes and zebras and things like that. And Peru, we've got one of these woolly hats. You know these woolly hats you get in Peru, like tassels either side? And they're not different from sheep wool. What wool does it come from? Llama wool. Right, and this one has a llama, embroidered on it. We've got the US presidential seal, which is American bald eagle. Right, in Canada we have some Canadian art featuring maple leaves and beavers. Right? So you get an idea of the kinds of things that are all over the world. Now, what about when it comes to the Jewish people? What are the animals that are part of our cultural heritage? It's not the gefilte fish and the chicken soup. In fact, in the whole of Tanakh, there is not a single mention of chickens. Why not? Why are there no chickens in the Bible?
There weren't any chickens in those days.
They weren't invented yet. Right, where did chickens come from? They're made in China, right? In China, there's a bird called the Asian jungle fowl. A very, very shy bird that I've tracked in the jungles of Thailand. I'm very nervous, but you can't get anywhere near it. It's running off in the undergrowth. The Chinese managed to capture some and domesticate them. Right? They selectively bred them to be calmer, to be more manageable, fatter. Eventually exported them around the world as the chicken. Right? But that wasn't yet widespread in the biblical period. In the Talmudic period it was. Right? Talmud certainly got plenty of references to chickens. But in the biblical period it was still a very rare thing. That's why there's no chickens in the Bible. So what are the animals of the Bible? The animals of our cultural heritage, right? The lions, the gazelles, right? The crocodiles, the bears, the leopards. Now these are not animals from Golders Green, right? These are not animals, or think about the shtetl, right? Every shul in the shtetl, right? The lions on the, like I said, in this shul now, they're more than the Sifrei Torah. In all the shuls, it was on the Aron HaKodesh itself. They would have lions, right? Now, very approximately, how many lions were there in the shtetl?
None.
0, right? There weren't any lions in the shtetl, right? But it's all a cultural memory of when we lived in the land of Israel and we were surrounded by lions, right? Till 800 years ago, there were wild lions roaming the land. And the reason why they're mentioned 150 times in Tanakh is that they were such a prominent part of life. And that's why they were illustrated in the temple, and that's why King Solomon had models of lions on his throne. Right? And that's being carried forward into the synagogues in Europe. Right? So, you can look at the animals that they painted wrong. Right? They got the tzvi as a deer instead of a gazelle, and the nesher as the eagle instead of the griffin. Also, you can look at it as, that's a mistake. But there's another way to look at it, which is they retained these as part of their culture. Right? They knew there's something called a tzvi, there's something called a nesher, there's something called an amer. We don't exactly know what it looks like anymore, but we want to retain that as part of our culture. As opposed to, say, when the British went to America, and where there was a deliberate choice to select a new American bird as their symbol. Right? There was a dispute between whether it should be the bald eagle or the turkey. I know it was Jefferson. It was this. Was it Jefferson? Was it the turkey?
The first animal was a snake.
Oh yeah.
Against the British government.
Really?
There was a snake on it.
Interesting.
On a flag.
Interesting. But ultimately, they wanted, a new bird. Whereas the Jews, no. It's always we want to remember the animals from our homeland and the plants too. It's very interesting. So on Seder night, right, mitzvah to eat matzah. So if it's a mitzvah, an obligation to eat matzah, you have to know what is the minimum amount that's considered to be an act of eating, right, as opposed to just nibbling. What's eating and what's nibbling. So the definition of eating is a kazayit. Right? How much matzah is that?
More than you think.
Technically decided.
Show me your fingers. How big a piece of matzah is that?
It's not very big.
So you have all these people,
Centimetres.
most people will a piece of matzah like that. Now, what does kazayit literally mean?
Olive.
An olive. So why are these people eating these huge pieces of matzah? It's way bigger than an olive.
They think it'll...
No, that's not why.
They used to think that the orange was bigger.
So it's more complicated than that. So when I looked into this a couple of years ago, I found something very interesting. All the medieval rabbinical authorities around Spain, Spain, that region, none of them discuss how big is a kazayit. If you really dig deep, you can find some passing references which make it clear that they are of the view that a kazayit is very small, a ninth the size of an egg. But there's no focused discussion on it. You have to really search to find anything. The focused discussion is all in the writings of the medieval rabbis of Ashkenaz, of France and Germany. They're all talking about how big is a kazayit, and they come out with these very big amounts. So why is that?
No olives.
They didn't have any olives. Exactly. So that's the obvious hypothesis. So olives are only in the Mediterranean. I looked into it, and I confirmed it. There was never any historic trade in olives. My mother grew up in Wales. She never saw an olive. Never saw one. Olives were not eaten as a food. It was only the oil that was used. Right? And I found eventually, ultimately, the writings from one of the Ashkenaz rabbis who says that he traveled to the land of Israel, very difficult trip in those days, and he finally saw an olive for the first time in his life, and he couldn't believe how small it was. Alright? So the question is over then, so why don't they just, if they don't have any olives, why are they trying to figure out how big it is? Just come up with some new measurement. Just say, well, we don't know what olives are, so therefore we're going to say that the minimum amount of food that should be eating is an acorn. Right? But no, the point is they want to hold on to an olive because an olive is one of the 7 species that the land of Israel is blessed with. Right? So the point is you see it time and time again in every aspect of Judaism that involves nature, and there are many. Right? It's always only makes sense in the context of nature of the land of Israel. Right? Praying for rain on Sukkot. So I grew up in Manchester. Davening for rain in Manchester, it's ridiculous. But Judaism was not, that was not what it was designed for, Jews living in Manchester. It was designed for Jews living in the land of Israel. Right? Or Sukkot, right? The Abba Minim. Right? So you read these heartbreaking stories. I read this halachic response from a couple of hundred years ago. This area in Europe, where in the whole area they were able to get one etrog for Sukkot. And they cut it up into little pieces so that every community could have a piece of etrog. So the rabbi who was ruling in it said, this is not a valid way to fulfill the mitzvah. But just from the question, you see how desperate they were, right? They wanted to have some kind of connection to the land of Israel, right? The place they would face in their prayers 3 times a day. So, I think you see where I'm going with this. Somebody gave me an artifact. They gave me, it was a walrus tusk with an engraving on it of an indigenous tribe hunting whales. And before they even told me where they got it, because I know about animals, right, I knew exactly which cultures, right? I knew this wasn't Australian, this wasn't Africa, this wasn't Asian, this wasn't European, right? This was from the Pacific Northwest, right? Because Pacific Northwest is where you have people, hunting whales, and where you got walruses. I knew it was an Inuit artifact. Right? So, the artifact tells you, you look at the animals and the culture, and you know what part of the world this people is connected to. Right? So the same goes with Judaism. It's not just that we lived in the land of Israel thousands of years ago. It's that you look at what Jewish culture is. Right? Every animal, every plant, that's part of Jewish culture, it is the animals and plants of the land of Israel. Right? So it shows our connection to the land very, very powerfully. Much more powerfully than archaeology. Because archaeology is just that we were once there. But natural history is that we retain this connection to the best of our ability, even when we were dispersed around the world. Now, there's a flip side to this also. Which is, I was curious to see, what about for the Palestinians? And again, none of this has to do with political rights or anything like that, which is a whole different topic, but just this idea that's spread that the Jews are the Europeans with no connection to the land, and the Palestinians and the indigenous people who are really connected to the land. So I was curious to see, what's their, what are the animals and plants that are part of their cultural heritage? So I found that there's no animals. There's no animals that have any significance in Palestinian cultural heritage. There is one bird. There is a bird. It's a bird that appears on like Palestinian, and they try to do their own stamps and passports. Right? It's the bird they use, the official state bird of Palestine. And it's a bird called the Palestine sunbird. Right, which is a bird kind of like a hummingbird. I see them in my garden quite often. Very pretty little bird. Now, why is this the state bird of Palestine? So there's a story behind it. A story you'll find online in many places, which is that the Zionists really did not like that it was called the Palestine sunbird. Right, the Zionists want to erase the Palestinians, and therefore they launched an international campaign to have the name of the bird changed. Palestinians mounted their resistance and a counter-campaign, and they were able to stop the name of the bird being changed. And because of this victory, they were able to preserve the Palestine identity of this bird over Zionist attempts to erase it. That's why it was selected as their national bird. Very powerful story. Completely made up. Completely, utterly made up. Not only is it not true, it can't be true. Because there is no such thing as the official English name of a bird. English is a rubbish language. English words and names come and go all the time. So anything official to do with animals, birds, whatever, is only the scientific name, the Latin name, that has any significance. Right? What did happen was that there was a competition in Israel to select the national bird, and the Palestinian bird was one of the ones on the shortlist. And in the end, it was the competition was, the popular vote went to, anyone know? The hoopoe. Hoopoe. It's a bird in Israel, which has a very characteristic crest on its head. It's a very charismatic looking bird. Right? There's sort of nothing with erasing the Palestine subbird. How many Israelis even know or care what the English name of the bird is? It's not its name in Hebrew, it's not its name in Arabic. Right? Israelis don't care. Right? They voted for the hoopoe because it was a cool bird. Right? And this was just transformed into an international campaign to erase the name of the Palestine subbird. Never happened.
When was that, roughly?
No, it's in my book, Lines of Zion. Plants also. So the plant that's considered to be of great significance in Palestinian culture is the sabra. Now we think of sabras as being Israelis, and the Palestinians are very upset about that. They consider that cultural appropriation. Because I say that before the sabra was used to apply to Israelis, which started in about the 1940s, 1930s, 1940s, before that, it was a plant of great significance to the Palestinians. Not just the fruit, which they ate in various ways, but the cactus itself was the fencing around their villages. And there's various academic articles speaking about how the sabra cactus represents the timeless connection of the Palestinians to their land, and so on and so forth. Now, when I was making this big map of the world and looking at which artifacts to pin over different countries, so one resource I use to look at which animals and plants are significant in different nations is the coat of arms, right? National flags or coats of arms. Now, it's not always significant. For example, England, what are the two animals in the British coat of arms? The lion and the unicorn, neither of which were particularly commonly found in England, right? But were adopted for their symbolic significance. But often it's a good indicator. Anyone know what the Mexican coat of arms is, by any sense?
The Mexican, it's an eagle.
An eagle, right, with a snake in its beak.
Right.
And it is perched on a
Cactus.
cactus. The cacti are American plants. There's no cacti in Asia, there's no cacti in Africa. Cacti are American plants. The sabra cactus was imported to the Middle East about 150 years ago. So especially this idea of cultural appropriation, the Jews sold it to the Palestinians, well, the Palestinians sold it to the Mexicans. And the Mexicans, they also sold it. It was originally an Aztec thing. It was something with Aztec significance, and the Spanish, destroyed the Aztec civilization and took it. So, this whole path of cultural appropriation, you trace it all the way back, it's not going to get the result you want. But also, timeless connection to the land. It's been there 150 years. So I went through every plant, flower, fruit, things that have significance in Palestinian culture. And again, I'm not saying the Palestinians are not a people. They are a people. They have a defined political identity. Just like many nations in Europe. Is there a huge difference between people in Finland and in Denmark and in Sweden? No, but they have a political identity. Right? So the Palestinians have a political national identity. But when you look at what this political national identity is, right, so every animal, plant, fruit, flower that's involved in it is either something that's generic to all the entire Middle East, or it's something that's incredibly recent. Right? So this idea, again, none of this has anything to do with political rights, but this idea that is taught that the Palestinians have these indigenous people with this deeply, historic, harmonious, intimate connection with nature, whereas the Jews are the European industrialists who came and have no connection to the nature of the region, it's the exact opposite. So that is the subject of my new book, The Lions of Zion, which I bought in distribution in the UK, but I bought copies with me in England. One or two of my other books available here. And open up to any questions. Any aspect of animals and Torah. It doesn't need to be limited to this topic. Yeah.
If we come to your museum, and in particular your zoo, can you please show us a behemoth and a leviathan?
Absolutely.
Oh, really?
Sure.
So what are they?
Well, the behemoth, we've got a huge skull of one. We've also got a full-size replica. But not only have got a huge skull, behemoth, an animal mentioned in the book of Job, a gigantic animal that lives in the rivers and swamps, and it eats grass, and it has a huge mouth. It's a hippopotamus. Now again, in Europe, they weren't familiar with hippos. They had no idea what this animal was. So instead of translating behemoth, they just transliterated it. And that's how the word behemoth entered the English language to mean some random monstrous creature.
And the other one?
Leviathan?
Leviathan. So 2 months ago, I found myself fully clothed in the ocean. Why was I fully clothed in the ocean? I didn't fall off a boat. What happened was, I was at work, and I found out that there was a Leviathan, and soon it was going to be, they were going to bring in some diggers to bury it, and I had to quickly race over to the ocean to see it before I did it. Didn't have time to go home and get my swimming trunks, so I just zoomed right over there and fully clothed went straight into the ocean. I had to take every single thing out of my wallet and dry it separately. And I got to touch a great big Leviathan. It was about 50 feet long.
So what animal is it?
What's a Leviathan?
Whale?
It's a whale.
Well,
It's a whale.
Mediterranean.
And so it was a sperm whale that had washed ashore near Ashkelon. It just died.
Oh, yes. I think I heard about that.
There's been a whales in the Mediterranean.
what about the tahash?
Tahat. Ooh, that's more complicated. It's not clear what it is. I've got a chapter in it in my book, Sacred Monsters. Yeah.
What about in the Torah readings where Hashem is speaking through animals? Or at least the animals are speaking to the humans?
The donkey and the snake.
Donkey and the snake.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, according to Maimonides, that the snake is a metaphor and the donkey was a vision. Right. I don't know. It's interesting. Donkey and the snake, the opposite ends of the animal spectrum. One the ultimate enemy of man, one the ultimate servant of man. Yeah. Interesting topics, but
It's in the book.
no. No, it's all that master's thesis.
Not yet.
Not yet.
You didn't mention donkey.
Huh?
You didn't mention donkey, did you?
Donkey, yeah. My interests lie more with wild animals than with domestic animals.
Except for the chicken.
Yeah. I was fascinated by the way, one of the things we have in our museum is a hall of chauffeurs. We have, I think, the world's largest collection of chauffeurs from different animals. You have a spectacular chauffeur in the show here. Really amazing. I know. Must be
How old do you think it is? I mean, I haven't seen it before. I saw it
Right.
slightly when Henry...
I reckon it's got to be over 100 years old.
Well, I would have thought so.
Yeah, but the carvings in it, very, very special piece. Let's end up with one riddle. So the Leviathan, so we mentioned the chapter to Tehillim that speaks about hierarchies, right? Tehillim 104, which is in Rosh Chodesh. And that also mentions the Leviathan. Right, there's a verse, Shama Liyot Yehalekon, Leviathan Ze Yitzad L'Sachekon. It talks about the ocean and the ships sailing in the ocean and the Leviathan to play with. So what does that mean? Who's exactly playing with Leviathan? So Malbin, right, one of the 18th, 19th century commentators, he says it's talking about the ships. That the ships are playing with whales in the sense of how they go hunting whales, right? Not exactly so much fun for the whale, but kind of like a sport, right? Sporting with whales, right? Hunting them. And yet, is that really the meaning of the verse? What's interesting, there is no record of a whaling industry in the Mediterranean. There's whales in the Mediterranean, right? Saw one 2 months ago. But there is no history of whaling industry in the Mediterranean. So why did Malbin explain that verse as referring to whaling? And the answer is, well, I'll answer that with a question. Well, that is related to the issue of why he probably had a very large piece of matzah on Seder night.
Is he Japanese?
No. What were they hunting whales? Places where they hunted whales. England, right? England had a major whaling industry. America, right? Boston, right? Moby Dick, big whaling industry. What was it for?
For oil.
What did they do with the oil?
They burned it.
Light.
The light.
Light. It was burning it for light, right? What did they... In Israel, what were they burning for light?
Oil.
From where? Olives.
Olive oil.
Yeah.
Right? Here you had light from olive oil. In Europe, England, America, didn't have any olives, you had to hunt whales. Right? So Malbin, living in the context of Europe, right, probably had a big piece of matzah, because he didn't know how big an olive was, and he would interpret this verse as speaking about, it would make sense to interpret it as speaking about whaling. But what does the verse actually mean? Realizing that there was no whaling in the Mediterranean, it probably means that the sporting with Leviathan, probably is talking about God. Right, that God created Leviathan to play with, like, so to speak. It's like the mighty whale is nothing more than God's plaything. That's probably what the verse originally means. But again, it's understanding the geographic context and the significance of the land of Israel that explains all these things. Okay, so again, if anyone wants to buy books, I have them here. If you come to Israel, please visit the Biblical Museum of Natural History. If you'd like to support us in the work we do, inspiration, education, and also providing respite for many people traumatized by the war, you can find details there on our website about how to support our mission. Thank you very, very much. It was wonderful meeting you all here tonight. I'll take questions privately.
Thank you very much.